Hey guys, this is Dr. Mcfarland, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to set up the Quad Cortex with a real amplifier. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I am Dr. Mcfarland, and as I peruse the online forums, I often see questions that would probably make pretty good videos. So here recently, I saw a guy saying he tried the 4-cable method with an amplifier, and he just didn't like the results. So let's go ahead and test out a few different setups here that you can do using the Quad Cortex and a real amp. So in this video, the real amp I'm using is the Boss Katana, and it's really the only amp I have that has an effects loop. I do have a Supro tube amp, but it doesn't have an effects loop on it. So that would not work for this situation. So setup number one is simply going guitar into the input of the Quad Cortex, and then out of the Quad Cortex 1/4-inch output, 3 and 4 on the back, is going to the input of the amp. And what this gives you is basically a traditional pedal board and amp setup where all the effects are going into the front end of a clean amp. And then you can just sprinkle in some dirt, delay, reverb, any kind of modulation stuff you want. And you can just store that as a preset. And now you have recreated a pedal board in the digital realm. And I forgot to mention, I'm taking the record out on the back of the Boss Katana, and that's going into my interface, which is a Scarlett 808. So looking at the unit, we can just touch the screen and we can add in an overdrive. And I'm going to go ahead and just put in a green 808. And we can touch the block to adjust its parameters, or we can double tap to turn it off. So let's leave it on, and let's hear the sound just with these settings. All right, great. So let's move on a little bit down the line. We're going to add in a delay. Let's just go with a basic mono digital delay. We can slide this over. And that sounds good. And we'll add in a reverb. I like the ambience one. And let's see what this sounds like. So you can continue on and include compression, phase, flange, chorus, tremolo, pretty much whatever else you want. But this does give us a good basis on how we can use the front input of the amp to have a nice clean sound, and then just use the QC for all our effects. Okay, the second method we can do is actually use the same output we're using now, and we're going to take the cable from the input and insert it into the effects return on the back of the amp. Now what this does to the circuitry of the amplifier is it basically bypasses the preamp section, since we're plugging straight into the power amp section on the amp. So we could leave the effects in here just as we have it, but we probably want to add an amplifier to give us that preamp sound. And let's put in a US Prince. And this is what this sounds like now. Now the record out on the Boss Katana has a cab emulation already on it. And also, since I'm going through a real amplifier and playing through a real speaker, then I don't really need a cab in the signal chain either. But there are situations where you can bypass the cab that's in the chain, so you can have two different signals going out. You can have the XLR sending the full signal out to the front of house, and then the 1/4-inch outputs bypassing the cab and then going straight to your amp. Now, just for an example, there's multiple channels on this Boss Katana, and I'm going to switch it over to one of the dirty channels so you can hear what happens. So now I have the Boss Katana set to the brown channel, and this is what that sounds like. Well, why did it sound like that? Well, essentially, since we're bypassing the preamp section of the amp, you don't get access to any of the preamp section features like the tone controls, the preamp gain, and on certain amps, you don't even have control of the reverb. But with this in mind, we're going to switch over to another method. So this setup is called the 4-cable method, and it's called that because you actually use 4 cables to complete this setup. So the first cable is going from your guitar to the input of your device. In this case, it's the Quad Cortex. And then you're going to take a cable from the send of the Quad Cortex to the input of your amp. And now we're going to utilize the effects loop on the amp to send to the Quad Cortex. So the send on the amp is going to go to the return of the Quad Cortex, and then the output of your Quad Cortex is going to go to the return of your amp. And with all that said, this is what it sounds like. Uh-oh. So it sounds just the same as how we had it before. How could that be? Well, in this case, we have to tell the unit that we're actually using the send and return on the back. Because if we don't tell it, it's not going to know. So now we're going to add a block. And we're going to click on Effects Loop. Now I'm using Effects Loop 2. And let me bypass the amp in the signal chain. And now this is what it sounds like. So now what we can do is we can keep putting effects before the effects loop block and then adding effects after it, and that will route all those blocks to where they go into the amp. So anything before the block is going to go into the input section, and for me personally, I like to put filters, phase, flange, any kind of overdrive before the amp. Then after the amp, I like putting tremolo, chorus, reverbs, and delays. So let's click on a block here. And let's add in some modulation, and we'll put in a tremolo. Okay, we can still add in our overdrive. All right, so let's go ahead and name this. We'll call it dock amp setup. And now let me show you something really cool. So if we take out our effects block, we're essentially going back to the amp, and then we turn on the digital amp. This is what we get. So now what this means is we can play any amp we want through the Quad Cortex, and then turn on the effects loop and then play any sound we want from the amp. So really you can mix and match all you want. So let's turn the effects loop back on, and let's set the amp to a clean tone. Okay, and now we bypass the effects loop, turn on the amp. Let's actually change it to something a little more dirty. Let's do like an Uber lead, and check this out. Alright, so now what we can do is actually set up some scenes so we can play around with the different setups and utilize them in your next show or your next recording session. So I'm going to hold on the on-off block, and that allows me to set that up as a scene. So scene A is going to have the effects loop block on, and it's going to have the Bogner Uber lead off. Okay, we can also do the same thing for our delay. We can hold the on-off switch and for our tremolo, and for our overdrive. Okay, so in C and A, the overdrive is off, tremolo is off, reverb is on, and the delay is off. Now for scene B, we can have the amp on, effects loop off. We can have some delay on and overdrive on. So now let's check out this sound. We can touch on the screen, and there's our stomps and our scenes. So scene A is back to our clean. And scene B is back to our lead. Alright guys, I hope that was helpful to you. If you have any more suggestions for videos, please leave them in the comments down below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Mcfarland, and I will see you in the next video. Keep rocking.